we're continuing the theme of working through the aspects of the Paris Agreement. And what's the remit? It's a word that they use in the UK all the time, Hannah, but not so much in the US. What's the remit of heritage in climate action? And there's a fair amount in the Paris Agreement about adaptation. And someone said to me, oh, this panel has kind of an unwieldy title, The Role of Cultural Resources in Enhancing Adaptive Capacity, Strengthening Resilience, and Reducing Vulnerability. This is actually a quote from the Paris Agreement, verbatim. And so if the mandate of Paris is to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability, then what's our contribution to it? And that's what this panel is about. And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator, Dr. Hannah Fluke. Hannah's come in from the UK to be with us today. Maybe she'll give a little taste of what they're doing in historic England, but having witnessed some of it firsthand, I'll simply say that there's a tremendous amount that we in the United States and folks around the world can learn from the climate heritage actions being done in the UK, and we're lucky to have Hannah with us. Dr. Fluke.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks, Judy and Andrew, for inviting me. It's fantastic. It's extra exciting because it's my first time in the US as well. So I'm very pleased to be here. And I was thinking sometimes climate heritage can feel quite a lonely interest. And this is got that feel of kind of one of those slightly strange family reunions with some relatives that you've never met before, but it's very welcoming. So I'm extra excited to have made so many new friends as well. I was just going to say a few words about adaptation in particular. And in true traditional style, we've got to start with a dictionary definition, don't we? So, and I actually made a typo when I was scribbling this down just now. So adaptation as the change and the process of change that an organism or species becomes better suited to its environment. And I rewrote that as organisation instead of organism, but again, somehow seems quite fitting. And I think the experiences that the panel are going to present today will give a great insight into the ways in which, particularly in policy terms, we struggle with how that might work in reality. But a little bit about myself and about the organisation I work for. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist. My specialism is human evolution. So it's fair to say I've got a pretty long-term view of climate change. My PhD was on stone tool technology 500,000 years ago, give or take 50,000 years. So, and that is a period in our history that is defined by changing climate. And the importance that our species has. We are human because of our incredible ability to adapt to changing environments. And unfortunately, or fortunately, if we can carry that ability to adapt forward as we move into we're already in the Anthropocene, this is something that is going to continue to define our species. So I find great comfort in knowing that we have survived many ice ages and engaged with some quite challenging situations. However, that long-term view also brings into sharp focus the fact that the challenges and the changes that we are experiencing now are of a scale and a speed which has no precedent, and that is down to the actions of our species. So it can help to frame things as well as give us some confidence in being able to cope with change. So a bit about Historic England. We're the public body that looks after the historic environment in England, very similar to our sister organisation up in Scotland. You heard from David earlier. Unlike Historic Environment Scotland, we don't have direct responsibility for looking after our national collection of monuments and buildings. We have an organisation, English Heritage Trust, who were created about 3 years ago, who have that responsibility. And we work closely with them on that. So our focus when we're thinking about adaptation is very much in terms of advisors to government and advisors to those people who do have responsibility for looking after and maintaining our historic sites and monuments. Within Historic England, my role is to think about the environmental impacts upon heritage and what we can do to prepare for the risks and the opportunities. And most of that work is undertaken through either commissioning research, engaging with research that others are doing, occasionally undertaking our own research, but pretty much always through partnership. And I think that's another message that's really coming out today, is that none of these things can be undertaken alone. And in that spirit, I also have a role in chairing something we call the Historic Environment Adaptation Working Group, which is specifically looking at climate change adaptation across the UK, although we've recently invited our Irish colleagues to join us. And that is about trying to share the experiences and expertise that as the different countries of the UK and Ireland that we have, so that we don't have to be reinventing the wheel all the time. We share a lot of things in common. And I just want to shout out to our Welsh colleagues who, not at this moment because it's 11:30 at night at home, but earlier today, were launching their adaptation plan for their historic environment sector in Wales. And it's a draft that's out for consultation. It will be a very good read. So when I find out about it, I will be circulating it a little bit more. But in Historic England, we issued our climate change adaptation report, submitted it to government, and we had a number of commitments in there. They were very general. This was about setting the scene for how we were going to approach these challenges for the next 5 years. But I think they all chime with things that we're talking about today. The first was a commitment to keep a watching brief on climate change and its risks and as they change, and just being mindful of that and sharing that information with others that might need to know. The second was concerned with resilience and supporting resilience both as an organisation that employs people who need to work and get to work and have offices and all those sorts of things, but also resilience in our historic environment itself. Thirdly, to embed climate change in what we do. And I think, again, that's something that is coming across quite strongly. Our need to embed consideration of all aspects of climate change mitigation, adaptation, ways in which we can improve our world. And that brings me on to the fourth commitment, which was about promoting the positive role that heritage can have. And again, this is something that we've heard time and time again. We do have an awful lot that we can contribute that's actually very helpful. And finally, developing approach for dealing with change, inevitable change and loss, which relates very nicely to that last point that Brenda was making. And central to all of this is communication and about how we can have these conversations, the language that we use, both amongst ourselves and with other sectors. And one of the challenges that I've had in England is that a lot of the climate change work in government is overseen by Department for the Environment. We sit in a different department. The environment doesn't always remember that actually the environment includes the historic environment. So a lot of these things that we take for granted, I mean, in England, it's fair to say we've got these 10,000 years of people creating and shaping that landscape, but the same is true all around the world. And recognizing that fact is pretty important. But something that struck me today that is extra interesting is something about the language that we use. So we don't talk about preservation very much in England. We talk about conservation. But those in I'm married to an ecologist, so I'm allowed to say these things possibly, but those in the natural environment sector talk about conservation. They mean one thing, we mean something else. And I think when you talk about preservation officers, you're actually what we would call conservation officers. And it brought me back to a case that I heard of. There's a legal case from a few years back, which was actually about a geological site of interest in southern England that was vulnerable to coastal erosion. And a local person, very cross, that no one was protecting that coastline anymore. So they brought this challenge saying, you're not conserving this site of special scientific interest. And in the end, the ruling said that conservation didn't mean keeping it the same, that actually what was important about that, it was a geological site, was that process of exposure, being able to see the different deposits. And I think it's quite helpful for us to think about conservation as the process of managing change. We're not trying to keep things static. In fact, a lot of the time we can't, and we need to be realistic about that. But that can be quite a painful topic to address. So again, I wanted to put a shout out to an organisation called Climate Outreach, who I think are one of the endorsers of this event. They have a fantastic and not necessarily well used volume, very short, called the Uncertainty Handbook. And it's all about how you communicate with people and the language that you use and the ways that you can engage with different groups. And I thoroughly recommend looking at it. And the other thought that was going through my mind was coming back to this idea of storytelling. I think this is a brilliant thread. And one of the things that we've noticed in the work that we're trying to do to get the environment sector to take on board the historic environment and how we can positively contribute to climate conversation is the idea of storytelling. And Marcy, you're the one with the climate stories is your phrase, isn't it? Which I think is a fantastic way of bringing out that idea of narrating, of engaging with people in language that is accessible and that you can have conversations about. But it's also not just about telling. That's the problem with storytelling. It's also about listening, as I think someone said earlier. It has to be a conversation. We don't have all the answers. These are unprecedented times, and there are some difficult conversations to be had about loss and change and what we value. So I wanted to introduce our first speaker, Jackie Donnelly. So Jackie is Senior Architect in the Built Heritage Policy section of the Department for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, okay, in Ireland. My Gaelic is not great. You set standards for architectural conservation at national level, and you ensure that historic environment is considered in legislation. But you are in particular working on the National Adaptation Framework for Climate Change currently. So thank you very much.
So again, can I follow the other speakers by thanking Andrew and Julianne for the invitation to be here today. I think this came out of a meeting Andrew and I had in Dublin at an ICOMOS international meeting to talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We're on a very short time frame with this plan that I'm doing, that we're working on really the nuts and bolts of how do you transfer all this knowledge and all these aspirations into what happens on the ground, what happens to the actual sites, and trying to identify what's going to happen to them and how we can best adapt them. So a lot of these background documents have been mentioned today. I don't think the EU adaptation strategy of 2013 has been mentioned yet, but that's very influential on what we do because it obliges all the member states of the EU to take adaptation strategy measures. So coming out of that, we had our Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act of 2015, and that produced both the National Mitigation Plan and the National Adaptation Framework. So it's the adaptation framework I want to talk to you about particularly today. It was published in January of this year by our Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment. And it specifies a strategy for applying adaptation measures through different sectors of government and also through the local authorities. So a number of different sectors have been identified to produce adaptation plans, and those of us that have been chosen have to have these completed and presented to government by September next year. So why am I here? I should be at home working on this. So the key sectors that were asked include ourselves, built and archaeological heritage with my colleagues in the National Monument Service, and also biodiversity, agriculture, forestry, seafood, you can see all the others. And we were issued with sectoral planning guidelines to try and tell us how we should go about doing this. So actually, we volunteered on the built heritage and archaeological side to do an adaptation plan. I think there was some surprise when we turned up and said we wanted to do this among some of the other players at the table, but I'll elaborate on it a bit further as to why we thought it was so important that we were at the table for all this. So we've been issued with guidelines on how we're to set about preparing our sectoral plan, preparing the ground, setting up working groups, stakeholder groups, the process of identifying what kind of climate change impacts we're likely to see. And we're also told not to just think of the negative impacts, we're also to look for the beneficial impacts as well and see how we can exploit and use those as well. Looking at impact assessments, developing a plan, and then not a static plan, one that needs to be implemented and then re-evaluated and reviewed at a regular interval. So our Environmental Protection Agency, together with the Department of Climate Action, came up with these sectoral adaptation guidelines, which we're all working to. A lot of the problem has been just the uncertainty of what are we actually going to be dealing with. Like California, we're at the edge of a very large ocean. We're a lot further north than you are, unfortunately. So dealing with this uncertainty, we've been told to expect maybe hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, rising sea levels, and then extreme weather events, storms, high rain, driven rain, very intensive rainfall in the autumn and the winter in particular, which could lead to both rivers flooding and then just pluvial flooding itself, and drought periods in the summer. These were the kind of things we were laughing at until this summer, just gone by, when we had very prolonged dry spell, which was really a new thing for us, hadn't happened for many years. So we're trying to look at the kind of changes we can expect. I don't want to read through all these, but looking at the kind of things that might happen to our buildings and to our archaeological sites as a result of hotter, drier summers. We're looking at increased pest infestation potentially, or new types of pests that might start attacking the organic materials in our buildings. We're also looking at increased light damage to our interiors and our delicate finishes and contents, changes to our historic designed landscapes as well, losing trees and planted features. There's also things like increased pressure now to retrofit air conditioning, which was something that was unthought of in Ireland up to a few years ago, and what that does to our historic buildings. On the positive side, this summer we've seen many new archaeological sites have come to light. Anyway, you can see over on the right, this is what a site that turned up this summer in our World Heritage Site of the Boyne Valley, has shown up in crop marks. And a number of really amazing sites have shown up, often captured by drones, the increased access to this kind of technology by farmers, by, just leisure pursuits, and they're reporting them all to the National Monument Service. So there are good things as well as bad. Warmer, wetter winters as well. We're looking at increased vegetation growth, and particularly ivy, which is really detrimental to a lot of our masonry field monuments, of which, we have over 120,000 field monuments in Ireland, and many of which are masonry monuments, which are very susceptible to ivy growth like this. We're looking at saturation of our building fabric, increased humidity and mold growth. Again, making the organic elements of the building much more inviting to insect and fungal attack. On the plus side, we're getting a reduction in freeze-thaw cycles to saturated building fabric, so there are some possible benefits. Increased storm, the two pictures I'm showing there are the kind of storm damage and effects that we saw of Storm Darwin in February of 2014, where there was a lot of structural damage. As you can see, the castle there, 800 years after it was built, it was brought down by Storm Darwin to a certain extent. The owner panicked and took the rest of it down to the heap of rubble that you can see. And collapse, obviously, of vulnerable parts of the building, like chimney stacks and the like, and the loss of historic trees in our landscapes. We're also looking at sea level rise and particularly coastal erosion along the Atlantic coastline. You can see Dunbeg there, which collapsed over Christmas last year, 2017. A promontory fort in County Kerry. A large part of the cliff face fell away, taking with it part of the monument. A lot of archaeological sites have been exposed as well, particularly along the Atlantic coast. I've put in bold the bottom one there because I see, particularly for the architectural heritage, I think actually one of the biggest problems we're going to face is maladaptation. This is poorly designed adaptation and mitigation measures that actually do more harm to the buildings than if they had just been left alone. And lack of understanding of how these buildings work and how they should be treated. As somebody said earlier, many of these buildings have been there for hundreds of years. They've seen a lot of climate change already, and they have recovered from it. They're probably sited in areas where they were less prone to damage. But the problem is when people weigh in and try to either upgrade the energy efficiency incorrectly or repair them with incorrect materials and methods. Flooding again, we've had a lot of flooding in Irish towns and villages and other sites, as you can see, throughout the countryside. Softening of ground under foundations leading to collapse of structures, contamination from floodwater, and again then ill-advised clean-up works that come in after flood, stripping out interiors, stripping out building fabric, replacing them with waterproof materials, all of which have a long-term and sometimes even a short-term detrimental effect. So what kind of sites are vulnerable, and what are we looking at? And really, this is why I think it's so important that cultural heritage is at the table in these discussions, because every sector either owns or controls historic buildings, historic sites. The top left there is the building I work in, which is built as a government office building, still works as a government office building, over 160 or 260 years later, still perfectly capable of carrying out the job it was doing. We're looking at, rural sites, we're looking at urban sites, we're looking at underwater sites, archaeology, wrecks and the like. We're looking at communications infrastructure, telephone boxes, we have some historic ones left. We're looking at water infrastructure with, rural pumps and fountains. We're looking at archaeological sites. We're looking at bridges, many of which, even though some of them are many hundred years old, are still part of the infrastructure of the country. They're still carrying national roads, regional roads through the countryside, and they can be very damaged by climate change effects. We're looking at lighthouses and harbours. We're looking at railway stations. We're looking at interiors of buildings. So really, we're talking about just about every sector is involved in this, and this is why we need to be at the table advising people and advising other sectors on how to look after their heritage. So what needs to be done? First of all, we need to start assessing the heritage values and the significance of our sites, not only their cultural significance, but in the context of climate change and what this is going to mean for them. We need to evaluate the kind of threats they're facing, what the nature and extent of these are going to be. We need to develop and look more into the science and have an evidence-based approach to managing the effects of climate change before we start adapting our sites. We need to develop risk preparedness and resilience, and this is at all levels, from the private building owner who is seeing the floodwaters coming up the driveway, to government departments, to local authorities, to the first responders. We need to develop capacity at all levels. And as Hannah said, it's all about managing change. We're not going to hold back the climate. We're not going to leave our structures and our sites untouched, but we have to manage the change. We're going to need to identify potential adaptation measures, and actually there are a lot of opportunities in this for us. It gives us the excuse to go out there and increase the resilience of our historic building fabric and our building stock to catastrophic events. Actually going out and ensuring that there are improved maintenance practices taking place to buildings to deal with the worst effects of climate change, which could have a great beneficial effect to many of our buildings. We need to ensure that we have the correct skills and the materials there to maintain and repair and adapt our sites. And we need to prevent poor maintenance practices, or poor adaptation practices and works happening to buildings. And where necessary, we are going to have to develop a policy of managed retreat. We're not going to be able to save everything. We're going to have to manage the expectations of the general public about what is feasible to protect. And sometimes there will be structures and sites that will have to be recorded and abandoned. We also want to start a national dialogue on climate change and create awareness. We are going to need, it's at a local level, we're going to need the local knowledge of what buildings, what fields flood, what changes happen, and they are going to be the first responders as well to many of the things that happen to our historic buildings and sites. And we need to have the structures and the networks there so that we can all talk to each other and ensure the best protection for the sites. We need to support the custodians, the owners and the occupiers to help them protect their properties by providing guidance to them on how to mitigate damage and then how to respond and how to recover after catastrophic events, and then on what kind of adaptation measures they might need to take. We need to promote the development of skills and expertise needed to deal with all these issues. And we've been, part of the process, we have had to set up a stakeholder group. This includes everyone from the Irish Committee of ICOMOS to local authorities, the professional building institutes, even local history societies and the museums, gathering them all around the table as our colleagues and our stakeholders in trying to develop this national dialogue. Another thing we need to do is support research to understand how is our climate changing, what can we expect? What are we going to do? There are currently 2 major European-funded projects going on in Ireland looking at climate change and heritage. One of them is called Cherish, which is a joint Ireland-Wales project looking at heritage sites down the 2 coasts of the Irish Sea and around. And then Adapt Northern Heritage, which David's group, Historic Environment Scotland, are leading on, but it does include some sites in Ireland that they're looking at. And we're not just looking at climate change adaptation, we're also looking at climate change mitigation as well. We have a national mitigation plan, which is setting out the measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the economy. We're looking at promoting the sustainable reuse of our historic building stock. We're looking at doing this through grant aid, direct grant aid, but also through fiscal incentives to try and encourage redevelopment in our towns and cities, particularly the abandoned upper floors of many of our cities and towns where there is, many, square meters, thousands of square meters of unused property there that could be brought back into good use. We're providing owners of historic buildings on how to increase the energy efficiency of their buildings without causing damage. This book was published in 2010. We're now thinking of moving on to another level of providing more detailed technical guidance on upgrading energy efficiency of our traditionally built buildings. So what next? We're actually in the process of appointing consultants to assist us in developing this plan. There's going to be a lot of stakeholder consultation and public consultation over the next year as we count down to having to have our plan ready and laid before the government by September 2019. But this isn't going to be the end of the process. This has to be a living document. We're going to be obliged to review it on a regular basis every 3 to 5 years. So it's an iterative process. What we learn, we have to feed back into the next version of the plan and keep moving that way. So thank you very much.
With great pleasure, I'll introduce our next speaker, Oscar Guevara. Oscar works on climate adaptation as a climate adaptation specialist at WWF, and he also represents culture in the climate change specialist group of the World Commission of Protected Areas. He has an interesting background. He started off as a civil engineer and also has qualifications in environmental economics and risk management, and is currently working towards a PhD in sustainability. So thank you, Oscar.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for my strong Latino accent. You probably already know that. And I also try to speak very fast, so apologies also for that. Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation. I will be addressing 4 main topics. First one is, I will take you through 3 heritage sites in Colombia to just have a very quick overview. But now I will tell you in the second part why I am here. It's probably not that obvious, so I will let you know about that. And the third is future thinking, actually the reflection that I try to bring into this session, and just end up with the 4 takeaway messages that I try to keep them short, so if anyone is interested, you can tweet them. So first, short story about Colombia. So this is the city of Cartagena. Some of you know this place, have the opportunity to be there. Is a heritage site in the Caribbean, and is the largest fortress in Latin America. The question here is that it is at risk because of not only coastal erosion, extreme waves, but also the scenarios, the climate change scenarios related with sea level rise actually are telling us that this, unless we do something, it is very likely to disappear. This is the coffee cultural landscape. So Colombia is famous for its coffee. So we have a heritage site right in the middle of Colombia. It's called the Coffee Cultural Landscape. But also, as you can imagine, coffee is being challenged also by climate change because it's getting more difficult to grow coffee in Colombia because there is an extraordinary change in the seasonality, in the seasons, in the rainy and dry seasons in Colombia. It's very unpredictable. So it's very risky for farmers to grow coffee. It's just basically economically is not viable for them. So they are shifting from growing coffee to other different types of crops that are more weather resistant, and actually are more profitable. So somehow this is also another heritage site that is on risk due to climate change. And this is the latest heritage site of Colombia. So we are very extremely proud of this. This is the Chiribiquete National Park. It's called the Maloca of the Jaguar. This is in the Amazon. For those of you who have seen the movie Avatar, this is as close as you can get to Avatar in this planet. There are certain places, many places in here that no human being has been before, but also it's the largest tropical protected area, the largest tropical rainforest that is protected in the planet. So, but as you can also imagine, it is at risk because of climate change. And why we are saying this? Because according to the studies that WWF and other organizations have conducted here, about 50% of the species that are right now represented or distributed in these places are likely to move, to shift to another places, or to disappear. So basically, in the next 40, 50 years, this place will look completely different as it is right now. So having said that, I just finished the short introduction to the work that we are doing in Colombia and how heritage sites are related with climate change. Basically, I will talk about what nature-based solutions are bringing to this table, to the work that we are doing here. And just a few minutes before I started, I Googled the meaning of preservation. And one of synonym of preservation is conservation. So I work in conservation. So if you just try to imagine, we are in the same business. We are trying to keep things as they are for the future. And what kind of things we are trying to preserve, we're trying to conserve, is things that matter for society. Even if we are talking about ecosystems, species, ecosystem services, or places that have historical, cultural value, we are trying to keep them as they are the best way we can for the future. The question is that climate change is challenging the concept itself that is related to our work. Basically, conservation is no longer viable as we imagine it right now. The species that we care, the ecosystems that we care, that are represented in protected areas, are no longer viable in the future. So somehow climate change is challenging the concept itself of conservation. So one of the alternatives that we are working right now is on nature-based solutions. So basically, here's the definition by IUCN, that is the latest definition, is that basically we are trying to help nature to help people. So one of the shifts that are happening right now that are really important, and I try to emphasize on this, is that words and the meaning of those words are really important, is that we are trying to help nature to help people. So people think that we are working on nature and conservation because of the benefits of biodiversity itself. But actually one of the key messages from my presentation I would like you to take into consideration is that we are trying to address the needs and the priorities of the society by helping nature. So that's the whole purpose and the whole concept of nature-based solutions. But on top of that, it's really important that right now we and many other organizations are working on something that's called the Global DR for People and Nature. So somehow, what I'm putting together in this slide is that we are saying that nature is really important to achieve the targets or the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but it's also fundamental to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, it's the central piece of the targets on the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the thing here is that, again, we are trying to frame our speech, frame our conservation work in order to say that it's critical to achieve the priorities that society is putting together, like, for example, the Paris Agreement. So the question here is that what this slide is trying to reflect is that it is important to break the silos between the different approaches. So the question is that we, the people is working in conservation, that is looking to protect and to manage the best way we can natural heritage sites. We know that these sites not only important for the context of the Heritage Convention, are really important because they can make a very important contribution to achieve the Paris Agreement goals through carbon sequestration, through water regulation, through other different climate-related benefits, but also really important for sustainable development. And I would like to illustrate this with this graph. Probably so many people have seen this before. I repeat this graph every time because it really illustrates how we are trying to frame our work, how to be more positive and more action-oriented in the work that we are doing with nature-based solutions in different contexts. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see that in order to achieve the different goals that are related with poverty reductions, with sustainable development, with ending hunger, poverty, all things, the very fundamental step that we need to address are the environmental issues. How we do with biodiversity, with our ecosystems, with ecosystem services. Unless we do a better work trying to reverse the loss of biodiversity and we sustainably manage our nature, we won't be able to achieve the other development goals. And basically, this is one way to frame and to be more positive in the way we talk about climate adaptation, whether it is with the heritage sector or we are talking with different sectors, is the question that words are really important. And just like, I think it was you who mentioned it before, this is a human problem and requires a human solution. So the more and more I get involved into climate adaptation, whether it's here working with the Heritage Convention or with other different places, I repeat myself that this is an ethical issue. It's not a science issue anymore. I mean, science is evident, it's very clear what is happening, that this is irreversible, that we need to face. We are living in a world that is severely exposed to dangerous climate. And the question is, what are we going to do? So maybe we have to do it now. So this is a question that, again, I've been working on climate adaptation for almost a decade. And I started working by telling people that they need to be fear of climate change. And I was expecting that people was driven and motivated by fear. And I was very wrong. People is not driven by fear. So we are trying to go through a more positive message to say, no, we can do something, and we have to do something. And this is an example of what we're trying to do, is that we need to work together, people who work in conservation, but also people who work on development, actually want to achieve this economical and the society-related sustainable development goals. Which are the principles of the new way that we are trying or the way we are trying to design our work? It's called futures thinking, and the principles are described in the next slide. So it's really important is that this was before, or is still in certain frameworks, the last question: what do we value or what do we want? But right now, this is not the last question, it's the first question, is how the work that we do with heritage or with protected areas are important for people. It's just the first question. The first question that we would like to start our work is that, why do you think this is important for society? So instead of assuming that everybody is in the same page and that we all value the same and we say this place is important, no, the first question is that we try to revisit why people value these places. Because these values have changed over time. I present you the Chiribiquete National Park. It was declared like 30 years ago. Now it's a UNESCO heritage site, but first it was a protected area. And this protected area was declared because it represents the largest tropical forest ecosystem in the Amazon, well, something like that. But right now, it is more important for society for the amount of carbon it stores in the trees. And it's just as simple as that. We are getting more money because of the carbon that is stored there than actually for the amount of species that are represented there. And this is a clear example that is not just questioning about this place itself, but actually why society values the places where we work. And I'm saying that this is the most important question in future thinking, is starting to ask the people, why do you like to preserve this place? Why do you want to conserve this place? And the next question is how these values and benefits will be affected. So now we are talking about the same. We are talking about why I value this place, and these values that are represented by this place are likely to be affected. So now conservation and the conversation is flowing. And then we ask them how we can prepare our institutions to deal with that. So it seems simple, but it is important to keep it simple. So we are engaged, again, no, we are not driven by fear. We are not just talking about science, it's that we are talking about our daily work. And this is called the Values, Rules, and Knowledge Framework. So the purpose is, of course, to connect these ideas. And again, going through a common goal to the effective conservation, nature, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. So this is an example that what we do with nature-based solutions. But it applies, I mean, again, what I'm trying to highlight in this presentation is that we first start trying to connect with our stakeholders and the people that we are interested to work with, asking them, why do you value this place? Why do you think this place is important to preserve, to conserve right now? And it's really important, and also have a personal anecdote in this, is that if we go through the different heritage sites, whether it is cultural sites or natural sites, the people that we work with have feelings for those places. It's not just a technical conversation. It's not just showing papers and saying, well, you know, this is important for this reason, and we have published this, and this is important. I'm not saying that this is not important. But the question is that we ask every person in the audience that is interested in a management plan of a heritage site. It's no surprise that most of the people, if not all the people, has feelings about this place. And it is important because we are connected with people and we're trying to drive them to do something in a very positive way. So this is why we're starting, that it's important to address what society needs and what society prioritizes. So we like to say that it's new ways of thinking about the future, but actually it's not that new. It's just trying to frame things in a different way to make it work. Understand the present context and try to connect the present and the future. And to contribute, which is really important because hopefully by working this way, we are trying to contribute to the society's needs and challenges. Probably, yeah, again, so when we say we try to address societal challenges is that we want to people and stakeholders to commit to action, to bring them on board, to engage them into doing something, but also to try to unlock certain targets. Just like the example that I made with the Chiribiquete National Park, is that we haven't talked about administrating or managing a protected area just to maximize its carbon storage component. We are supposed to do something else. We are trying to preserve biodiversity and to preserve climate refugia for species and other things. But right now, this area is important because of the amount of carbon. And we have also high mountain ecosystems that are supposed also, again, because of the types of ecosystems that were represented there. But right now, they are critically important because of the water that we can get from those places. So that's like the kind of things that are evolving, is that there are certain targets that we need to bring into the table and people think about it, especially those related with climate adaptation. And we are, of course, challenging our stakeholders. And one aspect that I forgot to mention until now is that one of the things that is hard to say, coming from one of the largest conservation NGO in the world, is that instead of trying traditional or business as usual conservation, right now we are more into the agenda of facilitating transformation, which is completely different. If you go again through the dictionary and say what conservation is preserving, is maintaining things. But right now, probably we are the more aware we are about climate change is that we are working on facilitating transformation and trying to enhance resilience. And probably some of you are familiar with the concept of the red list of most vulnerable species. Some of you, or the red list of most vulnerable ecosystems. Right now, this is changing. We are not only looking for the most vulnerable, we are looking for the most resilient places, the most resilient ecosystems, the most resilient species. So the question is that our entire concept is changing. And remember that I say that conservation and preservation are synonyms according to the dictionary. So this is my message that I'm bringing to you, that actually our reflections about conservation is taking us from the exact meaning that you can find that has worked over the past through a different meaning. Right now, for us, conservation is most likely to mean facilitate transformation. I try to enhance the resilience of nature, which is completely different. Same places, but different purpose. And consolidate adaptive management, which is something easy to say, but very hard to do. We have been saying adaptive management, but really, really difficult. Because legal framework, most of the legal frameworks are not designed for adaptive management. They are designed to be something fixed on time and many other different barriers. But actually, one of the things that has proved to be the better tool that we have, one of the best tools that we have, is to facilitate learning situations. We have experienced so much climate variability, so much extreme weather events in the different parts of the world, and we need some time to learn about them, about what was good, what was effective in the way we manage and we handle these situations, but actually what didn't work. It's not about future climate change. We have experienced a lot of climate variability and a lot of extreme events, and we need to learn that. So actually, learning from that experiences is very important, and create new forward-looking options. So actually, we need to anticipate, and this is called, futures thinking. So this is probably the key message related to adaptive management. Yeah, this is my last slide. So the takeaway messages, probably this is everything that I mentioned before. So I put a lot of text on this slide, but probably I put the key message on the top is that heritage has a key role ensuring the values that society needs. It's extremely important that we recognize the value that it has in order to create a more resilient society. It's like, as someone mentioned before me, I can't forget the name, but heritage is like the glue that sticks together the society. It's really important because if we want a resilient society, that glue needs to be resilient as well. So it's really important that we identify what makes heritage resilient and build on that and decide management that is based on the futures that make heritage resilient. And the next years are significantly important. Transformation needs to start right now. Thank you. That's the last picture from Colombia. It's also a heritage site. It's part of the coffee cultural landscape. And thank you. Thank you very much.
So our final speakers, Shannon Shea Miller and Douglas Melwick from San Antonio, Texas. And they're going to talk to us about how to incorporate heritage values into municipal climate action and adaptive planning. So, welcome.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here. We're basically going to talk about what we're doing now, some of the why we're doing climate planning, how we're doing it, and how we're initially trying to figure out how we integrate with cultural heritage. And that's when Shannon will come up and talk about some of the initiatives going on in San Antonio that really do have climate impacts. So this is one of my favorites. Phrases from Dr. Hayhoe from Texas Tech. Basically, we can't plan for the future by looking in our rearview mirror because we're not seeing what's coming ahead. And we're already seeing impacts in San Antonio. Over the past 7 years, we have seen more above average 100-degree days than any of the past 12 previous decades. We've also had the city's 3 hottest summers occurring in the last 8 years. So we're seeing this now. Climate change isn't some future scenario that isn't looming. It's something that's affecting our population right now. We've also experienced some major events. We had a $1.4 billion hailstorm that occurred in 2016. It's an enormous impact. We also experienced Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And while that didn't hit San Antonio directly, it hit Houston. We are the closest big city to Houston, and so we received thousands upon thousands of residents that we needed to house, and that has an impact on our community. The other thing that we had done is working with some of our partners, we modeled what would have happened if the storm went a few miles further inland. And while our topography is different from Houston's, we're not a bowl, we would have seen catastrophic flooding. So these sorts of impacts are real. And in Bastrop County, which is a county northeast of San Antonio, we're seeing the impacts of a fossil fuel industry and consumption patterns. So what are we going to do about this? The other thing we did about a part of our climate planning process is we conducted some downscaled climate projections. And you can see, looking at 2040, it's going to get drier, 24 days, additional 24 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and summer maximum temperatures increasing by 4 degrees. And you can see part of the process is messaging. As the previous speaker had mentioned, fear doesn't work. And so trying to translate what a change in climate means for different sectors. What does it mean for our business community, for our residents, for our institutional partners, for the military, which has a large presence in San Antonio. And so you can see we're trying to translate that into what it means for different people. The more alarming issue is when we look towards 2100 as a part of these scenarios, the number of days over 100 jumps to 94 additional days, which is considerable. An increase in 11 degrees Fahrenheit over summer maximum temperatures. You know, it's 2100. It seems like it's a long way away, but the decisions we make now affect future generations. And the other big thing to consider is climate scientists are sort of stunned by how quickly change is occurring, that the climate models that have been around are underestimating the degree of impact. So any assumptions we have about, you know, is this going to be 2100 or sooner, we really don't know. So when we start, again, talking to the community about what this means, you know, we talk about the cost of living. It's hot in San Antonio. We pride ourselves on you know, cheap utility rates, but how much is it going to cost for you to cool your home? We know that climate change is going to affect public health. It's going to affect our air quality. It's going to affect ground level ozone creation, increasing rates of asthma in our community. It also means the increase in proliferation of vector-borne diseases. These are things that are things that our community members can understand. Again, public safety, how do we prepare our community? What happens when a community is experiencing the impacts of a flood event? They're cut off from emergency services. Do they have the ability to prepare and respond as a local neighborhood? So we're looking at all the different scenarios that people can relate to, and then finally, you know, we start looking at basically the overall quality of life and well-being of our community, and I think part of it all is about the culture of the community, and I think that's where the idea of cultural heritage fits in. What is special about San Antonio, and how can climate change put that at jeopardy? So as we go to the community, we talk about, again, you know, what do you want? What's the future that you want? We're not talking about greenhouse gas reductions. We're not talking about Armageddon. We're talking about, do you want clean air? Do you want clean water? Do you want job opportunities? Do you want a vibrant neighborhood? Do you want more parks and green spaces? Again, what do you want? And when we talk across the community, you know, people generally want the same thing, and they want the same things for their children. The key is really how we start taking action now. And so we're developing the city's first climate action and adaptation plan. It's being designed to be Paris compliant, which, depending upon who you talk to, is a moving target. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a very aggressive plan. It includes, very simply, how do we reduce our emissions, both as a municipal organization as well as the community. How do we prepare for those impacts? And that's looking at neighborhoods, it's looking at systems, and then how do we build overall resilience for our community. And this is my last slide. The big thing we're trying to figure out right now, and we're working with Shannon, and I think really sort of looking at some of the work that's been discussed here today, is how does cultural heritage fit into that? So we're developing a process of evaluating co-benefits for all strategies. So if we're improving energy efficiency through a strategy, what other benefits does it have? Economic vitality, it improves public health. We have a big foundation in equity, and I think there's a relationship to cultural heritage. When we start looking at equity, we really want to make sure we're focusing on vulnerable populations. They're the ones that are going to be experiencing the brunt of these impacts. But the other thing we know is that a lot of these neighborhoods are resilient. Research that was done after Superstorm Sandy found that some low-income neighborhoods responded better and were better prepared than some other more affluent neighborhoods, based upon the culture, based upon the social cohesion and the networks that that community had. So we want to figure out not just how we build resilience in those communities, but how do we basically make sure that we can learn from them for the rest of the city. And then finally, again, this whole cultural heritage, we're currently trying to figure out what's that definition and what's that metric by which we can start applying it through the plan's development. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Shannon.
So I'm happy to be here today and wanted to add my thanks to both Julie and Andrew for inviting Doug and I to be part of this really important conversation. San Antonio's World Heritage designation recognized intangible heritage as part of our outstanding universal value. And to that end, our office has been working very diligently to lead a community conversation to identify and celebrate the heritage in our city, both tangible and intangible. And we're doing this through a variety of ways, both internal to our city organization and then, of course, externally in our role as the agency charged with protecting our city's cultural heritage. We're focused internally on the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This summer, we hosted 2 ECOMOS interns that did an extensive inventory of how city departments are already implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and how we could be doing it more explicitly. Sometimes we're doing it, we don't know that we're doing it, and so really educating our internal partners. And then Doug's office, as he kind of mentioned, is working with our internal city departments to identify and measure and then really identify ways to eliminate our carbon emissions as we go through the process of doing business at the city. And I feel very fortunate to have a partner like Doug who understands that in a city like San Antonio that so identifies with our cultural heritage and is known for its history, that we have to make sure that heritage is a part of the conversation related to climate action planning. So the Office of Historic Preservation is out in the community in San Antonio every day, and we're always trying to find new ways to engage with the community and give property owners and homeowners the tools to be better stewards of our existing built environment. The photo that you see on the slide is a wood window demonstration at our Historic Homeowner Fair. We do this every year, and last year, amazingly, we had people from every zip code in the city come to our Historic Homeowner Fair because it's skills that can be applied anywhere, not just in our local historic districts. We want people to have the resources that they need, and so we teach wood window workshops and other kind of technical skills like that. We also are actively designing or developing design review policies such as our solar panel policy and other sustainability related issues so that buildings can be adapted for use. I appreciated what Carl said earlier about, the most important thing we need to do is use our buildings. And so we want to make sure that as part of our design review in our local historic districts that we're making that possible and feasible for people. And then we also understand that based on a study that we did with Don Ripkema a couple years ago, we looked at the economic impact, but not just traditional things like job creation and heritage tourism and those sorts of things, but really found that our local historic districts are reflective of our city as a whole, from a race perspective, from an income perspective, from an education perspective, and so they really do represent the entire city. And then in addition to that, they have, of course, higher walkability scores, they have greater access to transit, and a number of other things like that that make them very resilient communities that we need to protect and replicate in our city as we plan for the future. And then we also are very interested in listening to our community. And so just last week we hosted the second Living Heritage Symposium, where we looked at practical tools for protecting our cultural heritage and for then leveraging that cultural and living heritage for economic benefit in the community. And part of that is the conversation about traditional building knowledge and other skills related to the built environment. And to that end, we host an event called STAR every year, which is Students Together Achieving Revitalization. And then we also have other events such as Rehaborama, where we engage volunteers and craftspeople to learn traditional building skills. And because we want to make sure that can be perpetuated to future generations. We also have a vacant buildings program that applies in our central business district and our historic district and other areas of the city that is really geared toward identifying those vacant spaces and making sure that we have the tools, we give the owners the tools to try to reactivate those spaces, because it's important to reuse the existing buildings rather than just move on to bigger and better, not better, and brighter. We are working currently to develop a deconstruction ordinance, which will require deconstruction and salvage for buildings over a certain age. And of course, this will serve to reduce the waste that's generated by the development community, but also really help to extend the life of existing buildings who can take the salvaged material and put them back into the buildings. And then we also, just this year, are launching a Living Heritage Trades Academy. We had a home donated to us through our foundation, and we're working with students at the University of Texas at San Antonio to both construction science students and architecture students, so that they can understand really how to work on existing buildings and think about how they can adapt those buildings for future use. And then beyond the buildings, we're also focused on living heritage, as I mentioned. We've been working with the community to help identify their heritage values. And so we've been working for the last 2 years to do an inventory of of the areas particularly surrounding our World Heritage missions. And it incorporates not just traditional architecture, but also cultural mapping. And so people have an opportunity to talk to us about where the places and traditions and stories that matter most to them and that really reflect their cultural identity. And then we work to catalog those. And then what we end up with is a very rich story that is authored by the community itself, that we can then use to kind of inform our future planning. So our charge going forward is, of course, to continue to listen to the community, to use this information as we conduct risk assessments on our historic resources and coordinate with Doug's team to produce a plan that respects and honors the values and promotes the reuse of the built environment. And also that not only preserves and protects heritage, but incorporates it into the plan as a strength that builds community resilience in the face of climate change. Thank you.